Okay. Just trying to make sure both platforms were working. I think they both finally kicked in. All right, y'all. How's everybody doing? I hope as well as can be, all considering. Shout out to MOT. Appreciate that. What's up, Grinch? TD Hip Hop Media. Appreciate that. Joe Average Brother, what's going on? I'm gonna let some people come in now. We got about 17. Please hit the like button as you come in. Share. If you haven't subscribed, be much appreciated. Black to Death, what's going on? Man Friday, salute to you. I'll let people come on in a little bit. Our Jizzle, what's going on? Yeah, trying to get something going here. Let's see. All right, so we're moving. All right, Ron Matthews, how you doing? Artisan, what's going on? Coming out faster on this one. All right, what's going on, people? Hope everybody's doing all right. Donnell Aquateki, what's going on? Brother with the crown symbol, I'm not sure what to call you, but what's happening? D Remedy, all right. Edeuce, I think it is. What's going on? Gravy Dale. Antonio, what's happening? Are you from the Bay, Gravy? All right. Cameron 87, you're in here. All right. I hope everybody is as well as possible, all considering. I know everybody's going through something or other, and it's a little frustrating, to say the least. Started having class yesterday, Tuesday. Thanks, Rodney Jackson, for the support. Started having class on Tuesday, remotely from home, obviously. And some of my students, are still working, many of them actually. And it's kind of terrifying, the kind of situation some of us are in, trying to survive, So I want you guys to be careful out there. Albert Bird, what's going on? And as I say, keep your head on a swivel. This stuff is getting more and more interesting. And as far as the expansion and spread of the virus, exponentially speaking, it's starting to slowly ramp up. And there are populations that are being underobserved, understudied, in my opinion, especially in regard to the homeless and the incarcerated. And I think those two populations alone, if this hits them, it's going to be devastating in terms of its impact. So I hope we all can stay up. But I also want to tell you guys, so next Wednesday, April 1st, I'll be back on innerlightradio.com. You can catch me live at this same time, 5:00 p.m. Pacific, 7:00 Central, 8:00 Eastern. And I will be interviewing, author. Let me get him up in here. Author of the book, Rethinking Rufus, Sexual Violations of Enslaved Men. So Dr. Thomas A. Foster, I'll be talking with him about his book. It's an interesting text, and it goes through and actually, gives you the actual words spoken by enslaved Black men and some of the experiences they've had. So if you haven't had a chance to check this book out, it's definitely one to check out. If you're not sure, definitely get with me next week. Like I said, innerlightradio.com. You can actually call in if you choose, and I'll be interviewing him from 5 to 6 o'clock Pacific. From there, I usually advertise on Facebook as far as the link, but if nothing else, remember innerlightradio.com, and you can check out the interview. What's up, Zeke? Ian, what's going on? Brenda, hello. All right, Anwar, the disciple. Idris Elbow, what's up? All right, so we got a few more people in here. All right, so just remember that, going through Rethinking Rufus next week. I wanted to kind of just give a couple bits of information. I know some of you, again, I share a lot of this stuff on my Facebook page. I don't really use Twitter a whole lot, but I definitely use Facebook. Nevertheless, I wanted to kind of just show a couple of things real quick, just to give some context to where we at, let some people come in. Just in terms of the seriousness, we're finding out, slowly but surely, the various stories that people have. So this is one about New Orleans bounce DJ dying from the coronavirus, right? Good looking out, Drew M. Appreciate the support. He said paying tuition. Much appreciated. Great Britain, what's up? Cats, how you doing? Curtis the God, what's going on? Right. So just to, kind of put some context to it, this is happening. This is impacting people. You know what I mean? And I want us to kind of stay aware of that. This particular piece, yet another that I had up on social media, but I think it merits looking at. Right. Most brown and black Americans are exposing themselves to coronavirus for paycheck. Right. So this is just reality of living, especially for most of us. Great Britain, appreciate the support. So this is the reality, right? This is the reality of what we're dealing with. It's impacting us because our feet are closer to the ground. So obviously, many of us have to be out in the streets. Again, I was speaking to one of my students. She works at Walmart, and she was telling me how they were hiring new people. And so she's being forced to train people. And then she said they were giving them a $1,000 incentive to not call in sick the entire time. And what that does, of course, is it means that people who actually are sick are incentivized to come in. And she's saying, in many instances, people aren't observing the social distance, 6 feet. They're coughing, they're sneezing on them. And yet, we got to be there to provide for kids and families. So, again, be careful out there. The impact of this is not to be taken lightly, right? And you actually start to see it impacting celebrities in an interesting kind of way. I saw this both about a concert pianist as well as Avengers actor Jeremy Renner, right? So when celebrities start crying about income in terms of how it impacts, say, child support, what is the average everyday person grappling with, right? NJ Prophet, you said your job is doing that. Now be careful out there, man. Let's see, intellectual novice. My job has me teleworking until the virus gets a result. Glad to hear that, right? Yeah. Oh, they giving out overtime. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Ian. Drop by the blog. Check that out if you get a chance. Some of what we're going to talk about today is related to the blog. So let me see. This is another one. All right. This will probably, I might bring this up a little later, but if you hadn't seen it, I want you to at least know about it. It's obvious. It's definitely, consistent with what we already know, but sometimes with certain people, including family members, we need a little evidence. So just something to be aware of, but also think about this in terms of how this relates to the prison population I mentioned before, being imprisoned and potentially grappling with this virus behind bars. So just to kind of get that out there. What's up, Fawn? How you doing? All right. Okay. So today, as I'm didn't mean to do that. All right. As we know, we are grappling with this film. Why y'all make me watch this mess, man? I mean, I know this is not technically a vacation, but I don't routinely ingest poison on a regular basis if I can help it. That's not true. I've watched a few of these kind of items, and yeah, I guess I do ingest poison from time to time. But I am trying to at least give brothers, especially with people, a view on Black men we may not innately have, and I try. I watched all four. The series for Self-Made, inspired by the story of Madam C.J. Walker on Netflix. It's four episodes, I guess you can call them, about 45 minutes each. And yeah, it was hard to watch, Fawn. It definitely was. Marvin says, I'm glad you're reviewing this. Big Poke Dog, appreciate that. Black Male Misandry was the whole series. Absolutely. LaShawn, man, I knew what it was and how it was going to be. I'd already heard a few rumors, but you got to be in a space for that kind of thing. And I wasn't really, excited about having to go through that mess. But anyway, I had a number of people ask me directly if I would watch it and talk a little bit about it. So I'm like, if this helps you kind of get through it a little bit, so you know what to expect if you choose to watch it, then I'm happy to help. Kat says didn't watch it, not planning on it. I don't blame you. I probably wouldn't have if I wasn't asked. I probably wouldn't have, but nevertheless, I mean, what I'll say right off the bat, Nick Morgan, good looking out. Appreciate the support. What I'll say right off the bat is simply that, I mean, this is made in the mold of The Color Purple. And if you don't walk away with anything else, as long as you've seen The Color Purple, then you already get the tone and the idea behind what images are brought through. All right, we got 100 people. Please hit the like button, subscribe, share as you come on in. So this is made in the footsteps and the blueprint of The Color Purple. And it's down to a science at this point, right? The sheer misandry, the perspective on Black men. I mean, Color Purple, I watched that as a kid and I read the book several times at that same time. And I remember seeing my mother and my aunts and my sister, they were all excited about the film. I didn't have the language to explain what I felt at the time. I just knew it was a feeling in my stomach I didn't like. But that's a feeling that many Black men have grown familiar with, not just from media, but even in our interactions with women, and from loved ones to, family members to strangers out in the street. This feeling that you often don't have a verbiage for, I would later call shame. I would later call rage. It was a mixture of things. But at the end of the day, I watched this film over and over and over again as a kid. And I watched this movie that everybody touted, and I couldn't remember one Black male in the entire film that wasn't a problem, right? And it felt like an assault on a little boy, myself and many of us. That kind of came out of nowhere for many of us. I mean, we had no context for it, but it was an assault, like somebody just walking up and hitting you in the face, and we couldn't understand the reasoning behind it. And yet it had high level studio backing. You know what I mean? It had, Steven Spielberg behind it. And so, written by Alice Walker, you had these powerful names, Whoopi Goldberg. I was even familiar with Whoopi Goldberg at that point. So, watching that kind of film and seeing this kind of star power, and then the narrative was so clearly anti-male. You barely had any whites in it at all. So there was really no context for racism. There was no context for white supremacy. There was no context for the time period. You just had male after male after male. That was precisely the problem. Well, there have been many films made in that vein since then, and it still continues to this day. And so if you have a chance to put this film on, you'll definitely see that it's still in play, right? So this kind of misandrous impulse, and really also this idea of pushing a sort of female dominance in the Black community as a solution, right, to historical, underdevelopment, to slavery, really the impact and legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. The idea being that Black female dominance somehow is the solution to that, and that's what you see in those films. And so they're still alive and well. Right. We know in the 1980s and 90s, we started to see other films coming out of Oprah's network, and that began to expand and flower. You had the Terry McMillan line. You had a number of others that came out. Then we get to Tyler Perry. And so this kind of narrative is popular, especially around a time period where Black women coming out of the 70s and going into the 1980s are starting to find employment. right? Fairly high level employment, consistent if nothing else. I mean, they're paid less than white women for the same job, but they're readily more employed, especially more so than Black men. And as I usually say, when you control for incarceration and military service, Black men actually make less than Black women. So as this dynamic began to rise, right, coming out of the 1970s, you had Black men more and more going into prisons. You had Black women, if they were poor, they were at least getting welfare support. If they were, you know, working class to middle class, they went to college, and that opened up career opportunities. So as you start to see this shift, this expansion, you know, of men and women going in different directions in terms of stability and economic growth, these kind of films become more popular, right? Because they're marketing to this new Black female intelligentsia with money. And so these films become more and more in line with what these women are writing about and which books they're buying, again, going back to the Terry McMillans and the Alice Walkers and so on and so forth. So that kind of narrative expanded this to the degree it's at now. So, you know, you can watch a series of these kind of films that continue these same tired tropes that really do go back to the 19th century as far as how the perception of Black men is shaped, and Black males across age even, right? So age isn't even a rescue. Boys are a problem even in these kind of narratives, right? So that's kind of what we're dealing with, right? And so what we're really looking at is a time period where we're being propagandized within our own communities, right? By those who look like us, by those who share the same experience. Absolutely the one. It's anti-Black propaganda. And it's happening in a manner that we support, right? And so it's already kind of a conflict just getting out the gate, right? So I'll start with some of the positives and get those out the way. Some positives, a few oddities, and then we'll get into, you know, my thoughts on it. Positives were, first of all, I actually was, you know, I'm glad to see Madam C.J. Walker acknowledged. My biggest problem is she wasn't acknowledged in a manner that was historically consistent. And we all know that they're going to, you know, they're going to do a little bit of that, you know, in terms of Hollywood, but it was just done to an egregious level in this series. But still, I mean, I'm glad Walker herself was acknowledged, you know, so I didn't have a problem with that. I mean, you're talking about a woman at the turn of the 20th century that was able to hire 20,000, you know, women. I mean, that was profound. I mean, so her as a historical figure, I honor. I don't have a problem with Walker. I had a problem with her portrayal in this film, and the portrayal in terms of how black men, in contrast, are represented around her. Right. Some of a couple of other things that were cool. The period, the way they you know presented the period was pretty interesting. Even the technology. I mean, there's a point that's more consistent than you realize when it happens, where they're showing all of them, all the family and friends at the house, and they're listening, or they're on ticker tape reading about the Jack Johnson fight with the Great White Hype. You know, his big fight where he just dominates. And if you haven't seen, there's a PBS special on Jack Johnson that I show, Unforgivable Blackness, narrated by Samuel Jackson. That is incredible. If you haven't seen it, look it up. You might find it on YouTube. Powerful documentary, 2 parts on Jack Johnson, and they really go through the history, and it's definitely something worth seeing. But in this film, they actually show Black people sitting around this little machine that kicks out a little ticker tape with writing on it that really covers the fight, blow for blow. And so you had somebody reading it to everybody in the room, and everybody's eating and kind of talking and listening to people read. And it was a trip to kind of see that technology, you know, at the time playing out the way it did. So, I mean, those kind of little period pieces I thought were really interesting. And that was, you know, kind of worthy. Even the clothing, that kind of took us back. And to be honest with you, again, at a gut level, you know, what I was looking at and what I found myself applauding was not really the acknowledgement of Jack Johnson. It was a time period where we all were Black, and we recognized that we were Black, meaning that, you know, you didn't really kind of have the kind of, you know, tensions to the extent that we do now, especially on the basis of gender. I mean, I'm watching this room full of people that understood that Jack Johnson's victory was a statement about Blackness against these kind of established stereotypes of Black inferiority, right? But they also understood at the same time it came with a cost, and there were many that were killed and beat up and brutalized after Jack Johnson's win because many whites were frustrated that he did so, and he did it. He did it embarrassingly so. So, as a matter of fact, you might even be able to see the actual fight on YouTube, which is worth watching. So, the period aspect of the film had moments that were cool. They had a good lineup of actors in this film. I will give them that. They had some people I didn't expect to see in there. Obviously, Octavia Spencer was there. Tiffany Haddish, she's a problem. I mean, she really plays the same character in every film. Carmen Ejogo was there. Blair Underwood. I didn't actually look up. I didn't go to IDBM. I didn't look at anything before I watched the film. I wanted to kind of be surprised. And I was. I didn't expect Blair Underwood to be in it. I didn't expect Garrett Morris, old Saturday Night Live, original member, I believe. What's up, BK Hammer? He was in there. I didn't expect to see Garrett Morris. I hadn't actually seen him since the Jamie Foxx show, and I know his health was in decline at that point, so it was good to actually see him. So, a few of those kind of people in there. Bill Bellamy, came in and he actually did a really good job. Matter of fact, I will go so far as to say, dramatically speaking, Bill Bellamy and Garrett Morris, this is probably the best dramatic roles I've seen both of them play. And I'll admit, I don't routinely catch them a lot, so y'all might be able to check me on that. But I will say Bill Bellamy did a great job for the character he was playing. He was actually playing like a number runner and a pimp. He wasn't really a runner. He was a boss, really. So that was a powerful kind of moment in terms of that. And that was unexpected. There's actually a moment with Bill Bellamy's character where you don't even see him, and it's moving to find out what happens with him. And that actually says something about the acting he does up to the point where his character goes through some things. Just to be clear, and I say this every time I do a media review, spoilers. I don't understand doing a movie review without spoilers. So if that's not something you want to hear, I don't know why you're really here. So I will be giving spoilers. But again, going back, Garrett Morris, this is probably the best dramatic role I've ever seen him play. He plays the father of Madam C.J. Walker's husband. Right. So she plays the father, and he plays the father. So he's her father-in-law. And he has some sit-down moments with his son talking about what to expect if, you're with a woman who's in a different space. She's producing, she's out there, she's making money, and you're kind of living under her. He has some very interesting heart words for his son. And even some bonding that he does with, Octavia Spencer's Madam C.J. Walker that are interesting. So, Garrett and Bill Bellamy do a good job. Oddities. Well, the film was made. I mean, the series was really strange. Some of the music. If you like films, historical pieces that have music from a more contemporary era, then you might like this. I mean, they tried this with The Great Gatsby with Leonardo DiCaprio, I believe. If it was the same one, you had moments where I think it was Jay-Z rapping in there. It was, it was a little awkward, but if you don't mind that, you won't mind it. So there's some music in here that's definitely not period specific. They had like this British rapper in there. She was doing her thing, and then, some weird R&B choices. The songs themselves, not all of them were bad. They just weren't period specific. So I really wasn't ready for that. Yeah, Cats, Garrett Morris is in it, he said, still not watching. No, I ain't mad at you either. Bill Bellamy was West Indian Archie. He was what West Indian Archie was to Malcolm X. Absolutely, Fawn. Absolutely. So there were some moments like that where the music would come in, it would just be a little awkward. And then you also had some moments where dancers would come in and just be dancing behind a scene when Madam C.J. Walker would be imagining something, and it was just real kind of awkward. It was like, where is it? Kind of came out of nowhere, and it really wasn't clear cut. So there's some strange moments there. There were some additions to the film that weren't really historically accurate to the life of Walker and her contemporaries. So there's a real strong colorist impulse to this, right? Where a good portion of the film becomes about C.J. Walker's competition with the character Addie Monroe, I think it was. And Addie is played by Carmen Ejogo. And so you have this, light-skinned biracial, character up against Madam C.J. Walker, and that becomes the impetus for their tension the whole way through, right? Where Addie actually comes in. Now, Addie is based off a real-life person that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And so they do some very strange things with her that don't really make a whole lot of sense. The real character is Annie Malone. And so Addie kind of plays this, really light, bright, woman who's using her lightness to advance her hair product company's growth. And she works with Addie. She works with Sarah Breedlove, who becomes Madam C.J. Walker, helps her grow her hair back. Walker ends up, wanting to be a salesperson for Addie, and Addie says, no, basically you're too dark. And so you have this ongoing tension between dark and light women in the film, which is an issue in the Black community. But the problem was it really wasn't that kind of issue for C.J. Walker in that kind of way. So it really was kind of jammed in, and it didn't make any sense. Good looking out, James Strickland. Appreciate the support. So it was weird, right, to have this kind of colorist kind of tension going on, and it wasn't part of the life of Walker herself in that way. I mean, I'm not going to say a dark-skinned woman in the early part, born right after, the end of slavery, didn't experience colorism. But if that wasn't a central theme in her life, why would you actually, change her historical story? Her story is good enough. It's entertaining enough if you want to put it in that context. I actually think history can be way more exciting than the actual fiction that's made of it if you actually go to do the work of pulling up the history. So that was weird. And those kind of choices didn't make a lot of sense to me in many instances. There was another running theme that was still based in colorism. And it was again, C.J. Walker and Addie, but at random moments, they would be in a boxing ring. And if I remember correctly, you'd hear like the sound of Jack Johnson actually fighting in the background. And they were supposed to represent Jack and the great white hype he was fighting. And it was just really strange because that wasn't a central theme in C.J. Walker's life, right? So these random moments where you see Octavia Spencer and Carmen Ejogo, in boxing gloves and dressed in boxing attire, dancing around the ring, supposedly swinging at each other. And it was just really awkward. It made very little sense. And the other contrast there too is you had Jack Johnson actually fighting a white man at a time period where being the boxing champion of the world at that time meant you were the strongest man in the world. It meant that you were an exemplar of masculinity. It was not something that Black men were supposed to have. So to have this moment where Jack, who learns this style of boxing that we take for granted today, where he's not just getting beat up and hit a lot. I mean, the man looked the same at the end of a fight that he did at the beginning. That was a new style of boxing, to actually cover up, to block, to move, to hit somebody and get out the way. I mean, Jack Johnson was doing all of this at a time when nobody had really done that, especially not at his level. So he's taking out these champions, these former white champions, and doing so without a mark on him. And he's walking into spaces where you had thousands of, all white audience, and he's beating a white man in front of all of them brutally. I mean, they're dripping with blood. He's knocking them out. It's at the point where they're cutting off the ticker tape. They're cutting off the film so nobody sees these white fighters go down, right? This is a time period where that was not expected. And he's really, in terms of imagery and representation, he's fighting and showing that Black men are men in a way that we were told we weren't. Because this is a time period where we were, effectively considered children, right? We were not considered men. We were considered less than. So Jack Johnson's symbolic, victory was important, was powerful. So that for them to take that, put it into the life of C.J. Walker and have her fighting a light-skinned woman, it was a little awkward. It just, So, those were some of the oddities. Now, just so we're clear, and you can find this on my blog as well in the About section, what I'm trying to do with this, and what I do every time I do a media review of something, is something I call a Black Masculinist reading. right? And this is something that can be done with all kinds of different things. It can be done academically, it can be done socially, it can be done privately, and you can do this with, film, art, dance. You can do it with literature, politics, and economics, social behavior, and basically, it's learning to read a narrative from the vantage point of Black males, but Black males, historically speaking, for the period. Right, looking at the context Black men are actually in and how their experience weighs against whatever the narrative of the story or whatever it is we're looking at. Right, how do Black men's feelings, experience, perceptions, and how do those things play into what we're looking at? And so, if you look at this film from the vantage point of Black men, both now, right, and in that time period, early 20th century, there are definitely some critiques to bring to bear. And the reason I say that is because this film is not considered a pure historical piece. They openly, bring in contemporary Black feminist politics and project them onto the moment and present them as if they functioned in the early 20th century like they do now. So this kind of, especially in terms of misandry. So what I do, and I say this, on the blog, Ian put up earlier in the comment section on YouTube, if you haven't seen it, but it's basically New Black Masculinities. .wordpress.com online, and if you click the about button, you'll see it. When I talk about a Black masculinist reading, I'm talking about the use of concepts that directly come out of Black male studies and Black masculinism, right? So concepts that address white supremacy, the Black male dual economy, what I call a synthetic Black gynarchy, and we'll look at that a little bit later. It's synthetic, it's manufactured, but it's nonetheless a reality at the end of the 20th century and plays out in our contemporary media. Anti-Black misandry, that should go without saying. Experiential narratives or Black male history, socioeconomic underdevelopment, wealth exclusion. This is something that not only the Black community experiences, but especially Black men, right? Because the social idea, right, the social expectation is that men are providers, men are the wealthy, they're the decision makers, and there was a very concerted effort to make sure that Black men could not play that role by any measure, right? And so to talk about that from a Black male standpoint is incredibly important because it's a reality, right? It's still in many instances a reality. So that's an important aspect of it. Media propaganda. Right. And there's a very distinct way that Black men have been propagandized against. Right. The tropes that go back really to slavery of Black male failure, of hyper masculinity, hyper violence, and through very distinct stereotypical characters like the brute or, like the Sambo, like, the Mandingo. You have very distinct characters that in each instance undermined Black masculinity and its potential, specifically to put forth the idea that Black men were less than men and were less than human, right? And so when you look at the role media plays, I don't care if you're talking about, the early newspaper clippings that you would see of Jack Johnson at the time he was alive, to, the development of film with Birth of a Nation and onward. All of these types of media productions, even to this day, still rely on the same vocabulary development, failure, and inhumanity, right? And so what makes these films particularly frustrating is you have Black feminist works that are funded really by the white establishment that use that same vocabulary, but they do it from a vantage point of being within the community. So if you watch a white film that has a stereotypical Black character, you can immediately identify it as racist and identify it as a problem. I'll give you an example. So as we're having this quarantine, I'm watching a whole bunch of stuff I haven't watched in a while, and I probably have 5,000 movies, just all over the place. So I watch a lot. And I watched a movie I hadn't seen since I was a kid called Space Camp, and it was quintessential 80s camp. It actually happened right after the Challenger explosion, and it was considered a little, in poor taste. Obviously, they made the film before the explosion happened, and they just put it out a few months later. But it's about these kids that go to space camp and end up actually going into space in a shuttle. And it's, it's a drama with a little bit of comedy. And they have one Black character, and this is the same brother that plays in Revenge of the Nerds. So if any of you remember Lamar from Revenge of the Nerds, you'll remember him. And so in this space camp movie, I'm sitting watching it. This is about 2 weeks ago. And it's hitting me with all kind of memories of seeing it as a kid. But I didn't remember the intricacies of it, right? So at one point, they're asking each other as kids, they're teenagers, why do you want to go to space? Why do you want to be in space camp? And each one, has their thing. This is actually Joaquin Phoenix's first role. He was a short, chubby little kid. If you actually haven't seen Space Camp, he's in there. That's his first role. And he wants to, emulate Luke Skywalker. There's Leia Thompson, figures in there, and they're all talking about what they want to do. And they get to the black kid. I think his name was Rudy. And he's a teenager, so they said, well, why are you here in space camp? And he's like, well, I want to be the first one to open up a fast food restaurant on the moon. And I'm like, the rest of them are talking about college. The rest of them are talking about being inspired by female astronauts and being the first woman in space. And this fool wants to open up a fast food joint on the moon. Obviously, white cast, white film written by whites about, in this instance, a black male. We can process that. We understand that to be racist. When you have those kind of narratives coming out of, works that are funded by whites, but written and directed and acted by black women, it takes on a different tone, because what it suggests is that there must be even more truth to these stereotypes if black women are the ones pushing them forward, right? There must be some truth to it. Now, one could say we see something similar in hip hop and the derogatory depictions of women. But, even if you look at hip hop from the 70s through the 90s, especially, during this period where we talk about, black men in hip hop, maybe early Red Pill, and the way they talk about women, a lot of the time you're talking about high school age, you're talking about 17 to 25-year-old cats who are talking about their experiences. But often with black feminist productions, you're talking about highly educated feminists with master's degrees and sometimes doctorates who are renowned. I mean, there's a very different kind of narrative going that you would think would impact the quality of these stories, and yet it doesn't. So anyway, so that's what makes these kind of films that much more problematic. What's up, Kendra? How you doing? So again, I'm doing a Black Masculinist reading, and I'm just trying to explain what that is so that, you can actually participate in it, develop your own, because we need to have a method for how we actually begin to see these things. And much of the time we've not been allowed to develop one. If you focus on black males in the academy, you have to do so by black feminist values, or else you're immediately considered to be a misogynist. You're immediately considered to be sexist. And that's it, even if you haven't really said anything. If you just center black men, there's a lot of attention on you. Like, how are you going to do that? And is it going to be done in a way that complements feminist narratives of gender? So I produced a way of doing so that is not beholden to black feminist narratives. Right. So some of the basic tropes of it, as far as what I could see, and we see some of this across race in terms of the representation of women, right? And this film kind of does something similar. Women are morally and inherently more truthful, more honest, more pure. They're strong just because they're women. And so you have this kind of moral authority arc that plays out in a lot of our films. And this is something I said even back when Fences came out. I talked about how, it's the women characters that actually end up providing the kind of moral direction arc of the film, and the men are all inconsistent when it comes to that. And that takes place here as well. The stereotyping of black men, of course, is huge. The black men and self-made are either failures, they're jealous of their women, they're emasculated, and we're not supposed to acknowledge that. Emasculation is supposed to be just a reflection of men's insecurity. It can't actually have to do with being dehumanized in contemporary parlance, right? You can't, if you point out how men are emasculated, the first response you get is either, this fragile masculinity, you mad kind of thing. And the underlying statement there is that, if you really understood gender dynamics, that, you'd be able to handle this emasculation and not see it as such. That's ridiculous, right? It's ridiculous. It's inhumane, and it's absolutely disrespectful. But to the stereotypes, I got to give a shout out to my boy, Dr. Lehman Basil. He actually sent me his thoughts as he watched it. And he said, watching this CG joint All the same tropes are there. The rapist, the stifling patriarch, the abusive, cheating, or irresponsible husband, the light-skinned sapphire, the lesbian love interest, they're all there. Another Walker and Morrison Black Misandrist production. And he's absolutely right. That's exactly the way men are presented in here. It challenges an idea of a Black patriarchy, right? Not a reality of a patriarchy. It challenges the idea of a patriarchy by suggesting that because these men are failures, they couldn't possibly be of any use. And it replaces the idea of that with an idea of a what I call, a Black gynarchy, which is basically, it's not a matriarchy. It's a female patriarchy, right? It's a female patriarchy that you have being espoused in these films. And C.J. Walker is the perfect character for Black feminist narratives about a female patriarchy to do that on, because she was so successful, right? So the imagining of it is, her telling people what to do, her always kind of being right, and the men not being smart enough to keep up. They're all kind of emasculated children. She has to tell them what to do. These kind of narratives, even to the point where at one point she kicks her husband out and says, pack your shit and go. Those are the kinds of, female patriarchal, practices that we'll see in representation that many of these feminists kind of get off on. And so you have that. You also have a trope where you have this idea of sisterhood, right? This idea of Black sisterhood. In some movies, you actually have it womanhood across race. But in this one, it's just this idea of a sisterhood, which is not a problem in and of itself. And I don't have a problem with films that big up Black women and especially when they're bigging each other up. That's not my problem. My problem is when they do it at the expense of the imagery of men, because it doesn't have to happen. And you see that a lot with a lot of the action films out now. I don't care if it's Marvel or DC, you have to have this idea. There's almost this fetishized idea of female strength. It's this, everybody, every description you hear of a woman always starts with strong. This is a real fetishized idea these days about what it means to be a woman. But in that definition of strength, the way it's measured and demonstrated is at the expense of men, the domination of men. Now, many of the action films, you have a 110-pound woman kicking 250-pound trained men through walls. She could be a secretary. She can even, her character may not have even been trained to fight, and yet she can do so simply because she's a woman. So female strength in these feminist narratives is articulated through the domination of men. And so we see that in this piece, not on a physical level per se, but definitely, in terms of just an overall level, especially in regard to intelligence and capability, right? LaShawn said movies in the 80s still piss you off. Yeah, but it really, they piss me off because I saw them as a kid. And when you see them again as an adult, you realize the kind of ideas they implanted that you don't even have the language at that time to confront. So, to me, it's an issue. Joe Average Brother says Space Camp was highly offensive. I found photos of Trayvon Martin at Space Camp. George Zimmerman murdered a potential astronaut. You out there, man. Anyway, so that's one. Those are a couple of the tropes. And another one was the notion of the emasculation. If you watch this, I think his name is CJ. Blair Underwood's character plays Charles James Walker. So he plays CJ. Madam CJ Walker takes his name. He's an ad man, and she's looking to start this business. So he helps her early on. And at least in the film, he uses his family's property, his family's house, and she uses it as the basis for her business. And I don't think that was particularly historically accurate, but for some reason in the film, they did that. So his family's property became the basis of her business. But that's one of the key parts of this story we'll get to. She only refers to it as her business. She doesn't share that with him. And, whenever she talks about it, it's hers. And he actually challenges her on that at one point, but she keeps doing it. It's her business. She doesn't share that narrative, even though she benefits from the sacrifices of the men around her, both historically and even to some extent in the film. Now, they don't cover this in the film, but historically, she had 3 or 4 older brothers who were barbers, and they were the actual first ones to teach Madam Walker about how to do hair. At that time, she was Sarah Breedlove. The barbers, her brothers were the ones who actually were the first to show her how to do hair. That's completely gone. She just makes mention at one point that her brothers were barbers, but they didn't show it, right? So black men are kind of downplayed in terms of their historical importance. And even in the film, as CJ, CJ's family provides the housing for her early business, it's, he's still kind of dismissed very early on. Let's see. And historically speaking, one of her older brothers is the one that introduces her to the woman that would be her mentor. Annie Monroe, what is it? I don't want to get her name wrong, because what they did is they recreated this character, Annie Malone, and they made her Addie Monroe. So please forgive me if I get the names mixed up. I'm trying not to do it, but they named the characters very similarly, and these characters, played a role in the development of Sarah Breedlove into C.J. Walker. So they recreate this character that was early on Walker's mentor and became her primary competition. But again, they did so by kind of popularizing this colorist trope. So I'll show you what I mean. All right. So on the left, you have the real image of one Annie Malone. And the character Addie that you see on the right, played by Carmen Ejogo, is very different. Annie Malone is actually pretty much as dark as C.J. Walker was, from what we can tell. But in the story, they made her into, this very light-skinned, long-haired woman. And in that, that sets up the tension. And it's almost in this scene where she tells C.J. Walker, "You're too dark. You can't sell my products. You don't have the right imagery. You don't have the right intelligence." And they set up this tension against the colors. But it's a really weird choice because, the real Annie was actually a dark-skinned woman. And I think she had like a high school education, which was a number of years, I think, because C.J. Walker only had a couple months of an informal education. And that might have been the primary difference between them, but it really wasn't color-based, right? So this was a strange choice, right? Okay. Catch up a little bit in here. All right. Okay. Let's see. There's some technical difficulties. Bear with me for one moment. Where'd it go? All right. Looks like I lost it. Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. All right. So anyway, it's a strange choice, right? Throughout this film, every male is a problem. Every male contributes to either the downfall or the massive disappointment of a woman character, right? And so it's this kind of thing that ends up being a consistent problem, and it drives home this notion of failure, right? So here you see Blair Underwood and Octavia Spencer as the Walkers. Acting wise, Blair did a good job, but it was hard to watch because his character was often emasculated publicly by his wife. There were moments where she berated him in front of a crowd of people because of a mistake that he may have made. There was a scene with Booker T. Washington. We'll have to talk about that in a moment as well. But one of the most consistent tropes with him and his character overall was the constant kind of emasculating, by Walker. And she teaches her daughter, who's played by Tiffany Haddish, Layla, I forget how they pronounce her name. She teaches, her daughter the same kind of misandry. So it gets passed on, which actually I think does actually happen in real life. But nonetheless, you can see it played out. Let me switch to, so I'll show you the various characters we're looking at and the kind of roles they end up playing. All right. So here you can see some of them here. Octavia Spencer, of course, Blair Underwood, Garrett Morris, Tiffany Haddish, Carmen Ejogo, and some of the others. You see Bill Bellamy there as the numbers boss, and his cousin, right here, whose name is Ransom. He's actually a lawyer who starts out as a bellhop, but he has a legal training, and Walker hires him to work for her company. He's married. He starts out by describing himself when talking with Walker, with his wife, with him, how he may have the degrees, but she has all the intelligence. So again, there's this constant deferring to women, right? And Ransom becomes what I would suggest is, a Black feminist imagination about what an acceptable Black masculinity is. He's quiet. He's deferential. He does what he's told, especially by women. He puts them above himself, and he does that throughout the rest of the film. Now, there is a point where he and his cousin, played by Bill Bellamy, get into some shenanigans. He gets some money Bill Bellamy plays a character named Sweetness. And, for the first time in his life, Ransom, who is his cousin, bets a little money so that he can invest in his boss's, CJ Walker's company. So all of a sudden he wins $500. He invested in the company and he feels good about himself, and he doesn't tell his wife or CJ Walker where the money actually came from. Sweetness comes up to him and basically says, "You didn't win the numbers. I just basically gave you the money because I want to be one of the primary investors." And so this creates some tension between the two. And for a good portion of the film, CJ Walker and Ransom's wife kind of, punish him like a child for making this errant, immature mistake of allowing this criminalistic Black man to have any kind of stake in this hair company, right? So there's this kind of moment there. And then the last character at the bottom left you see here is I think the actor is J. Alphonse Nicholson. I think his character is John Robinson. And Robinson plays, let me just make sure I'm talking about the right person. He actually didn't do a bad job acting wise. Yeah, that's him. He didn't do a bad job. It's just his character, the way it was written, was the problem. So his character, John Robinson, is married to Tiffany Haddish very early on. She's smitten with him. He wants to open up, a juke joint, and that's his dream. And what ends up happening is he ends up moving in at his wife's request with the Walker family, and then he's kind of forced. He's pressured into working and helping them with the family. So he becomes a part of his wife's mother's dream, his mother-in-law's dream. It's not necessarily his own. And there's some tension between him and CJ Walker because she actually doesn't trust him. And she lets her daughter know, even before she meets him, that he's just a no count. He's a no good, Black man, because he wants to be a club owner, which is already a problem for her. And it plays itself out. And we'll get to that. So these are the main characters, right? As I said, every male is a problem to women. Let's see. The consistent kind of underlying hatred of Black men plays out. And it's surprising because they don't address white women at all. The film does not touch on white women, which you would think would be an important aspect of the film, because you have Black women developing this hair care industry, building wealth off of an idea of beauty that, at least in America, in the West, they weren't able to ever really achieve. So you would think women's aesthetics would be a little more pronounced. No. White men are only addressed really to the degree that CJ Walker almost kind of idolizes them. She's always quoting from, I think it's John Rockefeller and other, famous wealthy white men. She ends up living next to one at one point. So she kind of pedestalizes white men. And the only couple of times you really see white men physically in the story is when she's trying to get them to invest in her business. And they, really for the most part can't do anything wrong. I mean, there's even this moment where, when a white man finally does invest in her, it's this hallelujah moment. So, the realities of racism, just like in The Color Purple, are kind of put off in the distance. And the primary problem is these Black women trying to expand, but having to deal with trifling niggas, in terms of their men. So this is the consistent trope that comes out. So white women aren't even a part of the story. White men are only a part to the extent that they become ideal representations of masculinity for Walker and useful, investors in her business, right? So it's that same kind of narrative happening there as well. So a lot of it, again, is projecting today's feminist values on the past in that way. Now, so to go into the story a little bit, it starts out very early on in her life where you see her for a moment. She's a little kid on the plantation. She was actually born a few years after slavery ends. And then from there, she's kind of I think it was at 10 years old. She's moved with her older sister and her brother-in-law, right? And he's abusive apparently. So at the age of 14, she marries for the first time to get out of that abusive household. Now, they say nothing of him. He's actually the father of Tiffany Haddish's character, Lelia, and they say absolutely nothing. And he died 2 years after she was born in real life. You know, the first man she married died 2 years after his daughter Lelia was born. They don't say anything about him. Now, I know there's very limited information, but again, if this is a film that's going to fictionalize a historical figure, then you couldn't say anything about her first husband. He had no existence. The second husband in the film apparently he was in jail. He gets out of jail. He sees her because she's lost her hair, and he calls her a mongrel. I can't remember if he slapped her or not, but he might as well have, you know. And he's drinking, walking out the door. Now, this is interesting. You see him for all but 10, 15 seconds. You never see his face. He comes in, calls her a mongrel, is drinking. I can't remember if he smacks her, but he walks out the front door while she's crying after him. So you got two husbands that are virtually invisible. The first one, we don't hear anything about, who just dies. She mentions that she's widowed at 14, but the man doesn't even deserve mention. I don't even remember if his name was actually said, and I couldn't bear it to watch it again to find out, so forgive me. But he's not even mentioned. The second husband is another no count, right? Dismisses her, walks out on her after getting out of prison. Now, historically speaking, I don't believe that was accurate either, but I'm blanking at the moment on her second husband. But nonetheless, you know, that's how they played him in the film, which again was unnecessary, right? So the first black male is invisible. The second one is this criminalistic, you know, misogynist, you know, drunkard, right? Right, exactly. See, Shields, you got the single mom trope playing out. So that plays out. And then the third husband ends up being CJ, who's played by Blair Underwood. He looks to be educated. He's an ad man, so he's working, you know, he's not working with his hands. All of that to suggest that he's supposed to be, you know, some kind of middle class, at least for what it was in the early part of the 20th century, kind of figure. And so by that, he's respectable, he's intelligent, and he seems genuinely enamored with her. He, you know, tells her she's beautiful, despite that she's not really heard that before. You know, he's always, you know, they make love on a regular basis, at least to the extent that he wants to. But she's always pushing him away to do work, to do her work, to focus on her business. So it's weird. You have this dynamic where her two first husbands are, you know, they fail to meet, you know, her approval on one level or another. But then you get to this, you know, butter doesn't melt in his mouth kind of middle class black male. That's everything that one would think a woman dreams about. And she can't, you know, she's constantly pushing him away to do her work, and he's enamored with her. So it was a real kind of strange statement about, you know, how women are supposed to look at masculinity, even an idealized masculinity. The idea is that men can't be trusted. Men need to be kind of coddled and handled like children. You can't invest too much in a man. And you hear her actually say things like this to her daughter. So it's strange. Yeah, for life, I hear you. Blair Underwood is always kind of playing those kind of figures, and it's absolutely true. It's not a whole lot. Well, yeah, he did the same thing in one of Tyler Perry's movies. He was abusive. But in this one, he's not abusive. He just ends up cheating on her, mainly because he feels neglected because she's spending so much time in her business. And, you know, and he cheats on her with, you know, a young light-skinned woman that actually works for her, which is supposed to be doubly painful. And it's really, you know, it's really a problem, I mean, in terms of how it's represented. What's up, BGS? So, all right. So you have that. So they start out very early. The two husbands, you know, are dismissed pretty quickly. And then she begins to develop a relationship with Addie, again, played by Carmen Ejogo. And from there, you know, Addie kind of helps her regrow her hair. And that's, you know, a big deal. So she's marketing and trying to sell products for Addie because her hair is growing. but Addie actually doesn't want her selling for her because she's too dark. So in the film, there is conjecture about this in real life, but I didn't find a confirmation because all of this story is based on, I think it's the great granddaughter of the woman that the Walkers kind of adopt into their family, who wrote this as an actual book. So in the film, she steals the recipe for this formula, this hair growth formula, from Addie. She actually steals it from her, right? And so from there, she builds this business with a stolen formula. And so they keep competing, Addie and her, back and forth. And again, it's these tensions with dark and light women. Let me see. They move to Indianapolis, and they start out working in her house. And there's this moment where there's an explosion in the house because the son-in-law, right, who's married to Tiffany Haddish, leaves on a smoking break, and apparently the items that he's cooking up that they're making into the hair products explodes. And so there's this tension throughout a good portion of the film about whether or not he was irresponsible, and he says it's not his fault. But again, it reinforces this black male failure trope, this trifling black male trope kind of plays into that. And so Tiffany Haddish's character starts to look at her husband with disdain. So again, looking at these two here on the screen, the bottom left cell with the man in the hat is the husband, and Tiffany Haddish. So she starts to look at him the way her mother does. And so you can tell they're separated, but this is also built upon because you now have this lesbian character who kind of comes out of nowhere, right? Now, I hadn't found any evidence that Lelia, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing her name, but Lelia was actually gay. I mean, she actually in real life married 3 separate times, but whatever. But her character ends up kind of being seduced by this photographer who works at the company, this black woman photographer. And so the narrative, just like in The Color Purple, is that really black women make better, partners for black women than black men, right? So she kind of seduces her. Exactly, Ronan, Harpo 3.0. She kind of seduces her to the point where even though she's actively married, she's clearly having an affair with this woman. Her husband's watching it, and he's growing more and more frustrated, but for some reason he stays there. He never opens his juke joint, and ends up kind of selling company secrets to Addie, right? So he's a traitor against the family. And when he's found out, everybody sees him as the trifling nigga that he's considered to be, which is ridiculous because the whole entire time he was helping and actually working for the family, he was still seen as trifling. So it was an interesting kind of moment where you got to see this, this hatred of black men played out very distinctly on different characters. Now, if you think about one of the major stereotypes, as it pertains to African Americans, you have the Uncle Tom. The Uncle Tom stereotype is a figure that is past his sexual prime. Usually you see him on a plantation, and his job is to enforce the old white supremacist code on the younger generations of black slaves. So he kind of represents the older period of slavery, obviously before 1865, and it's about acquiescence. He's older, he's past his sexual prime, he's no longer a sexual threat, and he represents this code. Garrett Morris's character is not explicitly an Uncle Tom, but at the same time, in my assessment, the way his character kind of plays out, he represents, a kind of black masculinity that again is past his sexual prime and is supportive, of women and their aspirations. So even against his own son, who at one point he's warning about being with CJ Walker, he's kind of chastising him to do right by her. So he represents this kind of older, masculinity, black masculinity that defers to, women in a particular way. Whereas Blair Underwood represents this kind of idea of black male achievement that's failed, right? Despite his education, despite his training, despite his field, he's still ultimately a failure. And so, and then when you round that off with John Robinson, the son-in-law, the husband of Tiffany Haddish, he is a failure and a traitor. So you have 3 modes of black men represented as 3 different types of stereotypical tropes that fail black women, right? One who's past his sexual prime, the other who cannot handle a strong, powerful woman, and the other who is just a no count, no good at anything, right? So these are the kinds of consistent tropes we see all throughout. And then again, and the last character, the one that's pictured in the middle at the bottom on the screen, Ransom, he represents another type of deferential black male who is still somewhat of a failure, but he's redeemed in that because he's willing to defer to women and they take an active role in guiding him, he's able to play a role that contributes to the advancement of women, right? So with the four characters there, you have this overall kind of statement about what acceptable black masculinity is and what it isn't. And the last one, of course, being Sweetness, who represents the nigger. He represents everything reprehensible in the black feminist imagination about black men. He's criminalistic. Even though he's dressed well, he ultimately, his end is that it's going to come as a product of his overall behavior, which ends up kind of happening. His character gets lynched, but he's lynched in a very different kind of way than you'll expect. And I give Self-Made this in terms of that. He's lynched because he takes his cousin, Ransom, the lawyer, he takes his cousin's son, little boy, out for ice cream. And the little boy is disrespected by some white little boys, and he checks them. Sweetness checks them. And in response to that, these white men lynch him, right? And so you see this moment where Ransom finds out about it, and he and Madam C.J. Walker cry a little bit. It's a little interesting. So on one level, you actually begin to think, wow, okay, they kind of redeem Sweetness. They redeem the nigger. They redeem him to the extent that, you know, even though he's a quote unquote thug and a criminal, he's clearly got some human impulses. But then you realize he's dead. So he's never recognized as one of the first investors in CJ Walker's business, even though he technically is. He puts in $500. But at the end of the day, he's never recognized. And regardless of whether he's somewhat kind of redeemed, his humanity is redeemed because he's, you know, taking care of his little cousin, he still ends up dead, right? So you end up with 5 men who paint a portrait of black male failure and black male and anti-black misandry. These 5 men are a portrait for how the black feminist narrative about black men plays out. And it's almost like a collection of them over time. Exactly, BGS. He's submissive to black women, especially when you're talking about Ransom. I think the other theme to Sweetness's death is that the underlying narrative is that if you don't submit to black women, your end will be tragic. Your end will be both either in failure, poverty, or death, right? Because we see something similar that actually happens to Blair Underwood's character when he and CJ Walker split. You know, she catches him cheating. They break up. He ends up marrying the woman that he cheats with. And then all they say at the end of the film is he's married for a few years. The marriage falls apart and he kind of dies. He kind of goes off into obscurity. So again, the message is that without the guidance of black women, black men have nothing to bring to the table and their future will be naught, right? Whereas black women, the way they kind of play this out throughout the course of the film, obviously CJ Walker becomes a millionaire. She passes the business to her daughter, Tiffany Haddish. They adopt a girl, mainly because Tiffany Haddish's character, Lelia, doesn't want to have children. She wants to, you know, be openly, you know, be an open lesbian in Harlem. So the idea is, you know, to meet her mother's desire to pass on the business to an heir, they'll adopt this young black woman who's a model for them, and that becomes so the new black family, the new successful black family in this black feminist imagination are a collection of women of different generations and different sexualities who all learn that men are failures. Men cannot ever really live up to their expectations, and the only thing that can is each other. You know, so it's almost like the new black family in the black feminist imagination is without men, right? So Lelia is you know, almost the product of an anonymous sperm donor, and then Lilia doesn't even have children, so they adopt. And so across 3 generations, the narrative is that men are not needed to produce family, not needed to produce the ideal black successful family. And ideal comes into play because these women are millionaires, right? So success becomes the standard of ideal. And anything other than that becomes a representation of failure, which is ascribed to the men, right? So that all kind of plays out in its way. She orders her husband and John, her son-in-law, around like underlings. She treats them like children at different points in time. This is really like a Black gynarchy wet dream. Let's see. There's a lot of respectability politics in the film, where she declares hair is power. And, she's trying to rally women around doing their hair. And that's obviously, there's a business component to it, but there's also this huge emphasis on the value of Black female beauty and what it will do for themselves and for the community, if they're able to get this together. And it reminded me of something that Tommy Curry said once. He was interviewing on Yvette Carnell's show. And at the time, we were responding to the article from Very Smart Brothers about Black men being the white men of the Black community, that crap. And he said something I thought was extremely profound. He said, they keep trying to make attention outweigh death. They keep trying to make attention outweigh death. And what he was talking about was, this push, because like one of the central critiques against Black men is that their incarceration and their deaths tend to supersede Black women's experiences, the focus on Black women, right? And so you had this point where if we can just get past talking about Black men, we can get to the importance of what Black women need to be talking about. And so he was saying that this push for attention outweighed the actual deaths that Black men were experiencing at the hands of police, at the hands of the carceral system, at the hands of, the state. That's what I noticed here. This push for this attention on hair outweighed the realities of the historical moment that were taking place at the time. And even the historical narrative. They bring Booker T. Washington, for example, into the story. And CJ Walker is trying to get an audience with him so he can help her get investors for her business. And he keeps not really wanting to meet with her. And there's a point where her husband, CJ, kind of locks him in the bathroom with Booker T. Washington and invites him to dinner. He said Booker T pulls a gun on him because he didn't know why he was doing it, but he concedes to come to dinner. So CJ Walker and them throw this big dinner with a lot of people and a lot of music. And, Booker T. Washington never shows up. And she finally just looks at CJ, her husband, and says, well, where is Washington? What actually happened in the bathroom? And that's where he says, well, he pulled a gun on me. I invited him to dinner. And, CJ Walker figures out, he's not coming. And so she begins to berate her husband in front of everybody, kicks everybody out of the party, and he walks out, like a child. So, but Booker T, when she finally does get an audience with him, he tells her, Black men first, you need to stay in your place. This hair thing, I don't support it. It's this image of Booker T. Washington as this kind of raging misogynist. And the interesting thing is there's no record of him saying those things to her, right? I mean, overall, what we found is that they actually did develop a political relationship, especially toward the end of her life. And that it wasn't that he didn't support her at all. He just didn't disagree. I mean, he didn't agree with the type of business she had. He felt like what she was doing was promoting a Eurocentric standard of beauty. And they kind of covered that in the film. But in order to get that point across, they fabricate this statement by Booker T, this like real, clearly misogynist statement that marks him as a bad man, as a failed man, as yet another, sexist or whatever. So they do that with Booker T. W.E.B. Du Bois is depicted in the film, but he's celebrated, and he's mainly celebrated because he celebrates women. Right. He's always supportive of her. And so he doesn't really get any negative critique. So again, just like Ransom, the only acceptable Black masculinity is one that defers to women and supports them in all endeavors, doesn't really challenge them, doesn't really check them, even if it's necessary, but defers. And that's considered acceptable. Let's see. There is a moment where CJ Walker tries to get Black men to invest before she gets to the point where she can get white men, and they don't really want to support her because she clearly overtalks her man. And there's a point where she goes to see this wealthy mortician to see if he will fund her, and he tries to rape her. So she comes home, she's disheveled, she's crying, she talks to Garrett Morris's character, whose name is Cleophas. Now that might be incredible. I don't know if that's his actual name in history, but that's definitely period specific. I've never met a Cleophas, so that may be as accurate as the film gets as far as the time period. But nonetheless, so she comes home, she's disheveled. He sees her. He kind of forces her to tell him because she doesn't want to say it. And she says, "Well, he tried to rape me. The mortician pulled his thing out, and I pushed him off, and I ran back here." And then Cleophas tells her, "Don't tell my son. It's not going to lead to anything good." So yeah, LaShawn, it's Cleophas. That's his name. But so Cleophas tells her not to tell his son. And so the next time, CJ walks in a room, he's there with his wife. She doesn't say anything about what happens, right? And that's the last time you see the mortician. So this is an interesting statement. From her first two husbands, you have no count poor Black men. From her current or her latest husband, you have a middle-class Black masculinity that's essentially emasculated, weak, and failed. With this wealthy mortician, you have he's kind of an alpha in the sense that he, out of all of the Black investors she courts to get them to fund her, he's the lead one. He kind of speaks for the group. So you have this alpha, wealthy Black male, right, who owns his own business as a mortician, which was a fairly dependable industry at that time if you could run it. And he tries to rape her. So again, across class, across age, across, across generation, all Black men fail Black women, right? From beating her to, failing her business aspirations to trying to rape her, And it's not to say that women didn't get raped at the turn of the century or they don't get raped now. That's not the point. What you choose to include in the narrative and what you choose to leave out are incredibly political things. They're important ideas, right? And that's one of the things we see here. The ideas that they included as far as Black men stayed consistent with these racist stereotypical tropes that we've seen since slavery. What they exclude is Black male humanity. The closest you see that humanity is when sweetness is lynched. But again, they don't even act out the scene for you. Good looking out, Jerome. Thanks for the support. They don't act out the scene. You don't get to see Bill Bellamy's sweetness take this little boy to get ice cream, confront these racists. You don't get to see any of that. The story is told verbally by his cousin Ransom. He's telling Madam CJ Walker what happened because he's sitting there crying and she asks him what's wrong. He tells the story. So you don't even get to see, this is interesting. You don't get to see him actually act out the most humane thing his character does in the film. And then he dies, right? You don't see him again. So in that powerful scene, you don't even get to see his face, right? Which is the second time a Black man's face is completely oblivious to the story. First time was with her he's her second husband, comes home from jail, smacks her, drinks, leaves. Second time is with Sweetness being lynched. The most humane act he does, you don't get to see it. So to me, there's a statement there as well, that you don't get to see Black male humanity in the context of Black women's lives be promoted, be celebrated. You don't get to see it. It ends up just kind of being dismissed. Okay. So from there, Lelia decides to move to Harlem. She convinces her mother to let her open up a business there. And from there, she has a string of lesbian relationships, but they don't work out because her mother is a traditionalist and trying to get her to marry in order to have children. And of course, by the end, her mother has to accept her lesbian lifestyle. But again, historically speaking, Lelia was actually married 3 separate times up to her death in 1931, I believe. So, that was interesting. Now, that's not to say because she was married, she couldn't be gay. I'm not saying that. But it is to say in the film, the way she's depicted, she's disgusted by men. She doesn't even want to be around them, right? Her whole circle is women. But that's not historically accurate from what we see with Lelia, whether she was gay, bi, or whatever. She's still actively married and had relationships with men. But I didn't see anything to indicate historically that she actually was gay. But I mean, in the Harlem Renaissance, that was an aspect of the experience. So there were many that were. And so I'm not saying that they're not there, or they shouldn't be. I'm simply saying that the narrative that they use in this film is one where Lelia has an almost disdain for Black men. But the historical Lelia apparently didn't. Now, she divorced a few times, but she actively married. So, I don't think the character is being shown properly. Grinch, appreciate the support on the Cash App. Thank you. So let me see. What else? I don't want to miss anything major. I figured if y'all gonna make me watch this, then I'm gonna try and take as many notes as possible because I ain't watching this mess again. There's a point after Madam Walker finds out her husband, CJ, has cheated on her. She literally walks in and catches him. Right. And it's the dumbest thing possible. She shows up at the house to talk to one of her employees, the one he's hitting. She walks in, and the woman is disheveled. She was actively having sex just before the door, she let her in. And then all of a sudden she sees the string of clothes on the floor. He kind of walks out disheveled and partially dressed and tries to say, appreciate the support, Sam. I am. He tries to give this bullshit excuse that he was there to coach her on something. I forget what he said, but he was there on business. But he's sitting there all disheveled. She's all disheveled. The bed is disheveled. It's smelling like, whatever. So she, obviously figures it out. But for a character like that, it was just stupid. It was just stupid. The way they kind of present it. He gets mad and they argue about it. And she tells him, pack your shit and go. He shows up, I want to say like the next day when she finally has these white, Harry Webster, appreciate the support. She has these white, potential investors who finally come to see, the factory because she buys this building she can't afford and she needs investors to get it off the ground so she can manufacture her product. So she finally gets these wealthy white investors to come look at it. And of course, CJ comes in at that point. He's still disheveled, got a bottle of alcohol. He's clearly drunk and he's yelling and screaming at her in front of the investors because, she kicked him out because he was cheating. Now, I didn't find any information to suggest that historically occurred, but in the course of the story, the narrative is that niggas fuck everything up. Excuse my language, but it is what it is. I mean, that's the narrative. They are continually failing Black women. And this appeals to Black women who are indoctrinated into this idea anyway. So, and if you figure we've had several decades of this media, that serves as part of the indoctrination. So this, is par for the course in that. So again, she has to reject him because, and she says something interesting to him. She says, you were supposed to be different. You were supposed to be on my side. Turns out you're just like every other man. Now, what's interesting about that is this is the first husband, the first man we see in the story that actively adores her. The reason he begins to pull away, according to the story, not historically, but according to the story, the reason he pulls away from her is because she begins to emasculate him and she begins to focus on the business and not him at all. So he's pouting like a child and he cheats on her to kind of get back at her, that kind of narrative plays out as well. And this is Casey Lemon. So, this is the woman who made Harriet. So for her, I guess this is becoming a more consistent trope of representing Black men the way she does, because she did the same thing in Harriet. She had literally created a slave catching figure that didn't exist, a Black slave catcher to chase down Harriet that didn't actually exist. I mean, if you're willing to fabricate history like that on Harriet Tubman, then you're going to be willing to fabricate history in regard to Madam C.J. Walker. Bill Monger, appreciate the support. Let's see. Okay. So again, the underlying idea is that Black women actually, not only do they not need Black men, but their success can only come when they've completely given Black men up. I think that's one of the underlying narratives of this story as well. If you can separate yourself from Black men, finally be done with them, your life will get much better. And we see that kind of played out. And we see it played out in a number of movies over the decades, right? So anyway, let me see. She has a bonding moment with John Rockefeller when she finally lives next door to him. Whatever. I mean, again, she's idealizing wealthy white men the whole movie. So she finally is able to get around one. And he suggests that, she not pay her employees who are protesting at her house at a conference that she's given. And she decides to actually go against his suggestions and keep her employees and not Because at the time, the whole question was whether or not she would mass sell. Rodney Lamson, appreciate the support. She signed on with a large chain to sell her products, and her, many of her saleswomen were upset at that because they felt it would wipe them out of the market, wipe them out of their position. So they were protesting at her house. Rockefeller told her, basically forget them, just do your thing. So she doesn't argue with them or anything. She's kind of, she's very deferential. She kind of walks away very quietly. And then she tells the women protesting, I'm not going to do this big deal. I'm going to keep it between us. And I'm going to, because I respect y'all. So it's this kind of bonding womanhood moment. But again, that wouldn't be a problem if the entire film wasn't predicated on this bonding of women at the expense of the imagery and representation of men. Let me see. This reminded me of I don't know how many of you may have seen the TLC movie that they made, but it was very much reminiscent of that, which was, again, in the blueprint of The Color Purple. Let me see. And I'm not sure if The Color Purple was the first of its ilk, but it definitely put a stamp on that blueprint, and it made it a consistent theme in the aesthetic of Black American entertainment. The theme being that women have to rise in spite of men. Let me see. Okay. Let's see. So I think that's it. I think I've covered all of that. And I'm only looking very closely through my notes because, again, I'm not I'm not watching this shit again. Anyway, so that's what I kind of got from that. I hope that was thorough enough. I apologize for being all over the place. It's just how my brain works, especially in regard to something that I probably wasn't in the space to watch. I mean, I was watching, Justice League animated movies and reading, so I was doing well. But if this helps, brothers, if this helps, people, get an understanding of what Black men have a problem with, both in terms of the feminist perception of Black men and these kind of media productions, then I hope I can generate a conversation and we can use some of these concepts and ideas and go out and analyze and critique other things and bring them back to the fold and share so that we can build on this, because there is space for this. Black men have a critique that bears listening to, even if by no one else but other Black men, because we're not taught how to think, for ourselves. We're not taught how to actually advocate for ourselves. I mean, again, I saw Color Purple 100 times, and then I remember my mother took me to see what is the name? Whitney Houston starred in it. It was one of those films came out, I think, in the early 90s. Damn it, which one was it? It was one of Terry McMillan's films. I just saw it. They played it the other day. Goodness, what was it called? Whitney Houston plays the lead in it. Anybody remember what the name of that was? What was it called? Waiting to Exhale. Thank you, Kate. Katz. Waiting to Exhale. I remember my mother took me to see that, and she was trying to show me, because even then I didn't want to see those movies, but again, I didn't have a language for it. And she was like, well, you will find it entertaining. So she took me to prove a point that those films could be entertaining. And I went to see it, and there were entertaining moments, of course, but for the most part, it was sickening. And for me, and I couldn't explain why. Now, my mother enjoyed it because it was made for her. She couldn't understand why I would have a problem with it, but the problem was I didn't know how to say what my problem was. And I think at that point I was in undergrad, for a couple of years. I didn't have the language. Nah, Big Poke. It wasn't Bassett. Well, no, Angela Bassett was in that one. Whitney Houston played the lead. That was the one where Angela Bassett is married to Michael Beach, and she burns all his stuff because she finds him cheating with a white woman. And, she claims that she helped build his business up and he lied and stole money. And eventually she wins in the divorce, and, she has this moment where she kind of falls for Wesley Snipes, but Snipes is married to a white woman that's dying. And so, you know, she has to kind of wait for him to go through that. So there's this moment where they try to redeem black men to a degree through Wesley Snipes, but Michael Beach plays this, you know, instead of being a trifling criminalistic dude, he's a trifling middle-class executive. And eventually, you know, he concedes the divorce and she gets everything she wants in the divorce and wins. And it's that kind of narrative. And, you know, I didn't have the language to tell my mother what I found, you know, frustrating about it, because I'd seen these tropes. But I think you had, you know, black feminists like, Alice Walker, who were writing these things, and there was no accompanying male response, right? This was the rise of the black gender studies programs, or, you know, the feminization of Africana Studies, where you had this black feminist critique becoming part of the canon of Africana Studies. You had the rise of intersectionalism, and that was beginning to bear some weight. You know, late 80s, 1989 through 1992, this time period where you had, you know, these kind of ideas starting to take up real estate in Africana Studies, but there was no space for an accompanying response by black men. As a matter of fact, I think many black men felt that responding was a sexist act in and of itself. And the measure of being a good man was to be able to receive this critique, take it as gospel truth, and then act accordingly. But I just showed you in the Madam C.J. Walker film, what it meant to act accordingly was to defer to women, to be quiet, to repeat their talking points and not challenge them. Otherwise, you were immediately deemed sexist, right? And so you had this catch-22 of either being quiet and deferential or being outspoken and being a sexist. And those were the only two camps that many black men found themselves on when it came to making these critiques, at least in the academy, but I think to some extent in mainstream culture as well. So anyway, that's about it. I'm going to go from there. I'm going to close out. Y'all know how I do this. And I'm here to, you know, tell you brothers that we are not criminals by birth, perennial rapists, incapable intellects, man children, sperm donors, child support sources, success objects, walking phalluses, ATM machines, lottery tickets, unpaid bodyguards, interchangeable stepfathers, child discipline proxies, unpaid repairmen, workhorses, or any other socially accepted dehumanizing stereotype. We're thinkers, inventors, innovators, leaders, fathers, and men. Embrace your humanity, know your worth, and extend your time, attention, and resources only to those who genuinely respect you. And remember, your worth is not defined by meeting people's narcissistic, selfish, and unrealistic needs. You define your worth. So I hope you do so. Peace.